Welcome to the Calm Analytics channel. I'm Boris Tizengauzen. Today, October 27th, there will be a lot of interesting news. In this episode, drones attack Moscow, China, and India are winding down their oil business with Russia, and Trump explained why he doesn't want to see Putin. The GUR is burning out radars in Crimea, and this is making the occupiers there uneasy. Meanwhile, the government has blamed Russians themselves for the rising gasoline prices. And how, in the fourth year of the war, has the Kremlin ended up surrounded by pickup trucks with machine guns? What's going on? We'll talk about this and more in today's episode. If this is your first time on the channel, subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. Donald Trump stated that China is significantly reducing its purchases of Russian oil. And according to Trump, India is completely stopping its purchases of oil from Russia. And Trump added that he would meet with Putin, but right now he doesn't see any point in it. In other words, he doesn't see any light at the end of the tunnel and doesn't see even a hint of a deal that could be made with Putin. Well, now here's a masterclass for fans of the Russian world. Let's talk to those who claim that Russia is an equal player to the US or China, or even not just equal, but that Russia dominates everyone. If Russia is truly an equal player to the US, then let Putin go and tell Xi Jinping that. And tell India's Prime Minister Modi as well, so that they don't comply with US sanctions. Do you think Putin could do that? And that's even though China is considered an ally of Russia and an adversary of the US. So at the time when Putin came to power a quarter of a century ago, there really were two major players, the United States and the Russian Federation. After 25 years of Putin's rule, there still are. Still two main players, but now it's the US and China, two global leaders. And Russia is just a raw materials appendage and a vassal of China. So what about that claim that Putin lifted Russia off its knees? It's more like this, actually. Putin lifted China off its knees and put Russia on its knees. He made Russia kneel before China. So when everything is going badly for you, when there's no progress at the front, what should you do? That's right, threaten with nuclear weapons. And Putin announced that the tests of the Burevestnik missile have been completed. Gerasimov reported to him that the missile traveled 14,000 kilometers and demonstrated the ability to bypass all types of missile defense systems. What a wonderful sequence of events. You have to agree, Trump is taking a very serious step to put pressure on Putin. He imposes sanctions against two Russian oil giants, Rosneft and Lukoil. The moth crawls out of the closet and says that the sanctions don't matter, that you'll end up paying for them yourselves. And in general, Russia won't do anything under pressure. The sanctions matter so little that Putin's special envoy Dmitriev is rushing to the US like a bullet, cunning as ever, trying to somehow reverse this whole sanctions mess. Following the old familiar thug habit, this is just his behavioral model. Well, Putin doesn't have any other. Naturally, Putin rattles his nuclear weapons, trying to intimidate the White House. In the White House, it seems like no one really cares at all about these Burevestnik nuclear tests. Let me remind you, this Burevestnik is also called the Flying Chernobyl. There you have it. And after that, a number of American media outlets report that the US is preparing another package of sanctions, not against Russian oil giants this time, but against the Russian financial system. And then the news breaks that Lavrov announced that Putin is ready to go ahead and accept the concept for ending the war that was proposed by the White House. I'm thinking, wow, that's something. That very concept Donald Trump proposed to freeze things along the front line. I'm thinking, wow, that's what these life-giving sanctions can do. How quickly did this mama's boy, the Kremlin's threatener, dragged Lavrov out of the racetrack and says, go on, make a statement, come on, we're in trouble now, another package of sanctions is about to hit. Turns out, no, the Russians were misunderstood again. And it turns out the Kremlin is ready to accept the conditions of the US, but not the ones Donald Trump proposed, rather the ones previously suggested by Steve Witkoff. And it turns out the conditions Steve Witkoff proposed are significantly different from Donald Trump's current demands. And what is this all about anyway? And how can the concept of a special representative for Russia differ from the concept of the US itself? So, unless this is an attempt to set up Witkoff, which I doubt, since Witkoff is quite a useful diplomat for the Russians, then this must be some kind of blatant unprofessionalism. Did Witkoff propose some kind of concept of his own there? Well, in general, the Russians themselves are confused about what they want and what they don't want. In general, Witkoff plays some kind of special role for the Russians. This envoy of Putin, Dmitriev, actually rushed to the US specifically to meet with Steve Witkoff. By the way, the Minister of Finance, Besant, said that Dmitriev is just a propagandist and there's no need to talk to him. Good for him, he sees things clearly. And the US Secretary of the Treasury said that sanctions will definitely be imposed. And you know what else is interesting? This Burevestnik missile, which is basically a flying Chernobyl, Putin said that everything went super successfully, instructed to determine possible ways to use it and to start preparing the infrastructure for its deployment in the armed forces. And he also said that Russia's nuclear forces are at the highest level, ahead of all other countries in terms of readiness. Well, you get the idea. And this Burevestnik, that's the most interesting part. How exactly are you planning to deploy it in the military? For a missile like this, especially one with a nuclear propulsion system, to actually be deployed in the military to go on combat duty, as they say, at the very least. Well, for this particular missile, you'd want at least 20 successful tests. So far, there have been 13 tests. Do you know how many of them were successful? Completely. Not a single one. What Putin just said about the missile supposedly flying for about 14,000 kilometers and being in the air for however many hours, there's no confirmation of that yet, because Putin is quite the talker. He just talks nonsense. At level 80. So, for this missile to actually be deployed to the troops, for it to be confidently rolled out to achieve full operational capability, you need 30 or really at least 50 fully verified flights under all sorts of different conditions, after acceptance tests and so on. So, how are you planning to deploy a missile to the troops? Well, fine, let them do it. We're not against it, really, as long as it goes off somewhere and takes out some Russians along with the test range. So it turns out without successful tests, maybe, well, I don't know, maybe there was one if Putin wasn't lying. Although, as we all know, he always lies. So again, it turns out he lied about the combat duty. Where's the Oreshnik? He said the Oreshnik has already gone into mass production. It's been in production for a while now. Where is the Oreshnik? Lukashenko keeps whining about it. They promised him the Oreshnik by the end of the year. Now they'll just put an inflatable mock-up there and he'll go around telling everyone about it. By the way, friends, do you remember how the unit from the GUAR, our Ukrainian GUAR, the Prizrak and Primara units burned 4 helicopters and 2 Russian amphibious planes in occupied Crimea? Well, yesterday they distinguished themselves again and set them on fire. 3 radar stations and also a landing craft to top it off. Why is this important? Because when our valiant GUR blinds Crimea's radar stations, it creates gaps in their air defense. After that, these gaps, well, the Russians can't quickly cover or close them. They can't because they have to bring in new radar stations from somewhere, but where are they going to get them if they're being destroyed every day? Plus, another important point, Ukrainian drones are now attacking at distances of over 2,000 kilometers, deep inside Russia, so now they have to cover targets deep in the rear with air defense systems. There just aren't enough radars and air defense systems to go around for everyone, so the answer is no. Radar stations. No money, but hang in there. This time, they burned up the radar of the S-400 Triumph air defense system, the P-18 Terek radar, the NU, and the Nebo-U. Excellent, an excellent haul. But that's not all. Your favorite phrase. Just recently, Rosneft's largest oil refinery shut down. I talked about this before. The Ryazan refinery, with a capacity of almost 14 million tons. So this refinery was also supplying fuel to the Moscow region. And now watch closely. Last night, an oil depot in Serpukhov in the Moscow region burned down. It's burning, blazing, just the way you like it. So what does this mean? They're taking out the oil refineries that supply Moscow with fuel and the oil depots that store that fuel. Local media report that the cause of the fire at this oil depot in Serpukhov was static electricity. We readily believe that. Today there was a massive attack on Moscow. Of course, we readily believe that. Soon they won't have any at all. The reason, the foxes found some matches, and so on as the story goes, and that's not all yet. Fires have been reported near the experimental Ramenskoye airfield in the Moscow region. Very interesting aircraft regularly visit Ramenskoye airfield, including those from strategic aviation. Because the runway is simply enormous, 5.5 kilometers, there are some extremely interesting visitors, including aircraft from the Ministry of Internal Affairs and the FSB. I'm clarifying right now what exactly was burned. As soon as I have information, I'll be sure to let you know immediately. But that's still not all. By the way, I think I can already hear it by the sound. Something's flying toward me. Dahl's and Ozhegov's dictionaries are probably coming for me over the word bots, right? Bots, that was the correct word to use. But you see, yes, sometimes I think maybe I should deliberately say some words incorrectly just to make people twitch, like saying logit instead of kladit, for example, right? There would be a billion comments instantly. A trillion even. The algorithm loves that. But I don't abuse it. So that's still not all. -1 Russian Ka-52 helicopter. This news came out right before recording. Russian aviation forums are already mourning the crew. What a pity. I'm practically tearing up here. I remember back in the early 90s, there was that movie about the Ka-52 Black Shark. The plot was absolutely idiotic. All I remember is the whole movie was set to this kind of music. Some old pilot destroys absolutely everything he can. He destroys everything and comes out unscathed himself. Just like that. So the plot lines there were typical for the early 90s. A classic, really zero plot at all. Some Americans, some Afghans, and then there was this opium king, Karakan, I don't remember exactly, and some American journalist who believed in the Russian pilot or whoever he was. Basically total nonsense. They just threw everything together in one pile. But now I realize that this film was commissioned back then. Kamov Design Bureau, which produces these Ka-52 helicopters, just to show how invincible it is, pierces from a distance. It'll kill everyone and destroy all the equipment from 1 billion kilometers away. Well, you see how it turns out with the Ka-52. Today, with the crew, as it heads out for review, but listen to the songs there, you'll like them. Friends, let me remind you, we have an important fundraiser for a vehicle with electronic warfare equipment for our UAV operators platoon from the 117th Brigade, who are currently carrying out missions in the Donetsk region, one of the hottest spots. They've been there for the second month now, and unfortunately, in the past few days, they've lost 2 vehicles. They're now left without transport. I mentioned that the drone hit the electronic warfare system directly. Everyone is safe and sound. It hit the EW system that was mounted on the roof, but in the end, they lost the EW vehicle. And naturally, this makes their task more difficult. They need to deliver everything necessary to the fighters quickly. To get out of there, but without a vehicle, it's impossible. That's why I'm really asking you to help. The guys are writing to me from there. They're telling me different details, like how the Russians... Now they're using these waiters, drones that just sit and wait, sometimes for days, by the roadside, and as soon as a vehicle passes by, they immediately take off and attack. In general, it's not easy, but they're doing great, heroically carrying out their combat missions. So let's help out. To our fighters from the 117th Brigade, the payment details are in the description of this video. There's Mono, there's Privat, and there's PayPal. For those who want to help from abroad, I want to say a huge thank you to you all. You can't even imagine. Even though lately it's become harder to close the fundraising goals, you are simply incredible. On behalf of myself and our fighters, I want to say a huge thank you. If you suddenly don't see the payment details, there's a QR code here as well. It also goes to the fundraising account. And today I saw just an amazing shot. I think that many of you have probably already seen it, actually. Let me show it to you now. These are Russian mobile fire teams near the Kremlin. I wonder, when the Pleshizava was puffing out his cheeks, banging his fist on the table, and talking about how he was starting this special military operation, did he imagine that in the 4th year of the war he would have to set up pickups with machine guns around the Kremlin? I think, by the way, that on a special order from the Kremlin, they've already bought up all the suitcases within a 2-block radius for the Botox Führer. I wonder, how does his protocol work in the Kremlin anyway? So Putin is sitting in the Kremlin, working late or something, playing with his battle Pekingese, Medvedev, probably, I don't know, tossing him a little bottle, and Medvedev runs off and brings it back already empty. And then suddenly there's an alarm, drones are flying in. Time to dive for cover, as they say. How does all of that work for them? It's like in those old movies about villains, where his chair suddenly drops down, somewhere I don't know, down below, and then the next shot. Putin is already in a little cart, racing underground somewhere, his 3 feathers fluttering, being taken to a secret bunker. So how does it all actually happen over there? And apparently they're not really being that polite with him anymore. Trump even said that he refuses to meet with him. Only if he agrees to peace with Ukraine, if a deal is made, then I'll meet with him. And Donald Trump emphasized he's really not mincing words anymore. Donald Trump emphasized that he doesn't want to waste his time. I need to be sure there will be a deal, otherwise, what's the point at all? And of course, he added that he's always had excellent relations with Putin. He's very upset that this bald-headed guy doesn't want to make peace, but every time we have good conversations, says Donald Trump, but in the end, it doesn't lead to anything. Well, so what, by the way? Donald Trump added that he always had the feeling that Putin wants to take all of Ukraine, but the US will not allow that. Well, what can you do? Maybe the Russians will try to start some negotiations again because the sanctions will be imposed in just under a month. And now the Russians are frantically thinking about how to get back into this negotiation process, how to once again entangle Trump in this web of negotiations, to confuse him like that, like a spider. Slowly and carefully, Putin will start spinning his web. Maybe they'll try to slip in some big or small projects on the side, money deals, or propose something else, like a tunnel to Alaska. Well, in short, judging by everything, in the United States, hardly anyone has any illusions left anymore, and that's what I want to tell you. This includes the work of the pro-Ukrainian lobby. As my American colleague told me, he said, "You have more friends than you think in the United States." I can just imagine if the sanctions had been imposed right away, so Donald Trump came to power, Putin deceived him twice, or well, whatever. The first time he refused to agree to a ceasefire. Trump says, yes, bring in Lukoil Rosneft. That would have been a little different. Here's an important point. Putin always lies, so Trump correctly identified Putin's goal. He wants all of Ukraine. Now, even if at some point he manages to capture the entire Donetsk region at the cost of enormous casualties, and that will take a long time, it still won't be a victory. Why does he need that peace? The scorched land covered in piles of charred bricks. Why does he need it? Is that what victory looks like? This whole gigantic Russia with its army, with its so-called best unparalleled nuclear and conventional weapons? Is this really all they were able to achieve? That's not a victory at all. That's why, of course, Putin will now try to imitate some kind of real negotiation process. And maybe he'll even start them, say, yes, we agree, let's discuss. Then, of course, they'll blame Ukraine for the negotiations falling through. This is classic behavior. So until a peace agreement is signed, an acceptable one, there can be no talk of lifting sanctions. I think everyone understands that. Any attempt to trick Donald Trump again? Here you go. Another package of sanctions. Any attempt at all? Try to drag out the negotiations and you'll get another package of sanctions. That's the only way, only by kicking. Only by kicking this Kremlin elder in the backside can you make him do something. By the way, friends, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit the bell. One fan of the Russian world once accidentally subscribed to this channel. He probably put his phone in his pocket and it pressed the button. Somehow the phone did it by itself. And already the next morning he realized that in fact you can't fight for your motherland on someone else's territory by attacking another country. That's why calm analysis in our turbulent world is definitely something you could use. So go ahead and subscribe. Putin is afraid of a coup d'etat because of the growing weakness of the regime. That's what the Telegraph writes. Well, partly, here I might not fully agree. He's afraid, but he doesn't think the regime is weak. He thinks he controls everything. Yes, Prigozhin with his black swan, and for some in the Kremlin he became a brown one. That was truly frightening. It was frightening for Putin. At that moment he appeared completely out of sorts, remember? When Prigozhin was marching on Moscow, there was no resistance at all. No one tried to stop him. Russians in the cities were even bringing pastries to Wagner fighters, calling them their saviors and so on. No one stood in their way. Yes, there was some attempt by the Air Force. They flew around, shot down a couple of aircraft, and that was it. They arrived. And then, when Prigozhin was marching on Moscow, the weakness of the regime was completely exposed. Jets were taking off like bees. They were just flying out of Moscow in all directions. I think some people were probably already evacuating things by then. Because the only ones who put up any kind of, well, I don't even know if you can call it resistance. You can't really call it resistance. Basically, it was Russian utility workers. They dug up the road with an excavator and then quickly filled it back in. When there were some conscripts with rifles lying in the grass on the outskirts of Moscow, well, it was just ridiculous. They were the ones who greeted Prigozhin. By the way, that's why this article in the Telegraph refers to John Herbst. He's the former US ambassador to Ukraine. I met John in Washington. He's a very, very smart and very knowledgeable, especially when it comes to Russia. So I'm glad that I have this acquaintance with him. By the way, this article also emphasizes Russia's economic weakness and its strong dependence on China. And it notes that if China wanted to, it could stop this war with a snap of its fingers. That's true. Or at the very least, it could crash the Russian economy. And as a result, the war would stop. There is no war without money, without big money. In general, Putin was very scared back then when Prigozhin was marching with his Wagner fighters. And yes, at that time, Lukashenko gave guarantees to Prigozhin. So basically, that's all you need to know about these two old ghouls. Not only do they lie, they deliberately don't keep their word. In other words, they think they can get away with anything. No, they won't. After Lukashenko gave Prigozhin his guarantee, remember, they blew up the plane with Prigozhin on board, and the place where the plane crashed was immediately leveled with bulldozers, just so no one would find any evidence there, God forbid. And regarding the weakness of the regime, the Russian FSB has opened a case against Khodorkovsky and members of the Russian Anti-War Committee for violent seizure of power and creating a terrorist organization. It's all very strange. I mean, it's clear that right now they're calling everyone terrorists, they're overreacting. Now you can get arrested for a post, a repost, or even just a like. All of that is clear. But this is a strange story. So Khodorkovsky is being accused of allegedly supporting, let me put it this way, financing terrorist Ukrainian nationalist units and recruiting militants for a violent seizure of power in Russia. But what is even the point of this? I just don't quite understand. It's especially funny because it would make more sense to finance not Ukrainian nationalist organizations, but Russians who are fighting for Ukraine. The Freedom of Russia Legion, the RDK. I'm acquainted with both groups. For the Legion, we closed 2 major fundraising campaigns. But as for the Russian opposition helping them in any way, I haven't heard of anything like that. Maybe something has changed in the past few weeks, but I don't think so. And actually, I believe the real Russian opposition is precisely the Legion, the RDK, and other groups made up of Russians with Russian passports who are fighting for Ukraine. You can hold as many forums in Europe as you want. Russia without Putin, the future of Russia, and so on. But how is that supposed to help bring down the Putin regime? And yet, for some reason, the Russian opposition periodically pushes the idea of lifting sanctions on Russians. As if to say Russians aren't to blame, it's Putin and his inner circle who are at fault. Well then, who is fighting on the front lines? Putin's inner circle. Then who is assembling shells and missiles at Russian factories? And who is it in schools that holds important conversations with children where they tell kids how honorable it is to die for Putin, for the motherland, and how they should kill Ukrainians? And who are all these people on the streets, the ones being asked about the war? And there's this little old lady, a sweet grandma in a headscarf saying, we should have nuked Ukraine long ago, just cover them all and that's it, everyone needs to be killed. I remember that right after their release, several Russian opposition figures who had been exchanged for Putin's spies held a press conference and said that sanctions against Russia, all of this is wrong and inhumane. By that logic, maybe we don't need oil sanctions either? Well, because with less income from oil sales, there's less money in the budget. Putin will cut payments to the social sector, but will keep the money for the war. So it turns out that oil sanctions lead to lower salaries for teachers. That means they shouldn't be imposed. That's the kind of logic we have. So let teachers go out and protest, let doctors go out and protest too. But if they can't go out to protest against the war, then let them protest for their own salaries, which are being cut. Recently, teachers' salaries have been cut in 12 regions of Russia. These are Putin's priorities. Almost half of the Russian Federation's budget next year will go to the military and security forces. This is also about Putin's priorities. And who's to blame? Let me read you some news right now. So just so you understand, they found those responsible for the rising gasoline prices in Russia and for the shortage of gasoline. And it's not Ukraine, not Ukrainian drones, nor their even more deadly debris. The head of the Ministry of Energy blamed the rise in gasoline prices. Do you know who? Russians? The record rise in gasoline prices in Russia over the past 14 years happened because of the rush demand from Russians for fuel. During attention scheduled maintenance at oil refineries, said the head of the Ministry of Energy, Chivilev. But in the end, it's still the Russians who are to blame. You know, when Putin loses this war, Well, when he realizes what a mess he's dragged Russia and the Russian economy into, do you know who he'll blame? Well, the Anglo-Saxons, of course, the Ukro-Saxons, the Satanists, and the Russians who didn't fight well enough for Putin and didn't win this war, who even had the nerve to ask for money to fight in this war. Why didn't you want to fight for Putin for free? What, are you not patriots or something? Well, friends, take care of yourselves, take care of your loved ones, and subscribe to this channel. And let's support our defenders from the 117th Brigade. Let's do something nice for them and finish this fundraiser for a vehicle and some wrap. The link, I remind you, is in the description of this video, for which I always say a huge thank you. Wishing us all a peaceful day and glory to Ukraine.